Chicos and chicas. In this video here, we're going to continue our discussion on the muscular system. We're going to focus in on the factors that affect tension production within a myofiber. So what the hell is tension production? What the hell is tension? So tension, another word for tension, is force. So when a muscle contracts, no matter what muscle it is, the amount of force can change. So even for particular muscle, it's not always going to be the same force, and obviously all muscles do produce different amounts of force. So we're going to look at the factors that affect tension production within a single myofiber. So first off, the length of the sarcomere affects the tension within a singular myofiber. So length of a sarcomere, there is an optimal length. So at optimal length, there's max tension production. So max production of force when a sarcomere is at the optimal length. Anything more or less than this optimal length, so anything longer or shorter than this optimal length of a sarcomere, tension production decreases. So there won't be as much force able to be produced when the length of a sarcomere is longer or shorter than this optimal length here. And the reason that is when the sarcomeres are too long, the myosin heads can't bind to the actin, and it won't allow, obviously, the myosin to pull the actin towards the center of the sarcomere. And when the sarcomeres are too short, myosin heads can bind to the actin, but there's nowhere to pull the actin, essentially, since it's already shortened, already condensed. So that's why the optimal length of the sarcomere does produce the max tension production. So whenever all the myosin heads are binding to actin, obviously going to produce a greater amount of tension, greater amount of force. But if they're too short, even though the myosin heads are binding, they're not going to be able to pull the myosin or pull the actin anywhere, since there's nowhere to pull it, essentially. So optimal length equals max tension production. So that's the length of a sarcomere. Another factor that affects tension production within a myofiber is the width of the sarcomere. So width of sarcomere is determined by the number of myofilaments. So we already discussed myofilaments in a prior episode, but the more myofilaments equals more tension. So a sarcomere with a greater amount of myofilaments is going to have greater amount of tension, obviously. So more myofilaments equals more tension. So if you increase the number of thick and thin filaments within a muscle cell, there's going to be stronger muscles. So the muscle cell actually doesn't change its size. Whenever people get stronger, get larger muscles, but the amount of thin and thick filaments within that muscle cell is actually what changes. So stronger muscles means there's more thin and thick filaments within a single muscle cell. So length of the sarcomere affects the tension production within a myofiber. Width of the sarcomere affects the tension production within a myofiber. And there's two more aspects that affect the tension within a myofiber. So the third one is the number and frequency of stimuli. So the one stimuli is essentially one ACH, one acetylcholine binding to the ACH receptor on the motor end plate, which stimulates the electrical impulse down the sarcolemma. So we learned about that in the last video, but one stimuli is one binding of ACH to one ACH receptor, which sends that electrical impulse. So another name for this is a twitch. Is by definition a singular muscular response to a singular stimulus. So one stimulus causes one singular muscular response. So stimulus obviously is kind of the start of the reaction, the pushing of a domino, if you will. It puts the reaction into play. So in the contraction period, the tension production obviously increases. So the calcium's channels are opening, and the AC binds to the ACH, receptor in the contraction period. So that's the contraction period. Contract. There's max tension at the top at that optimal length. Whenever there's max force, max tension due to the stimulus. And then the relaxation period is the decrease of tension production. So that's when the ACHE is degrading the ACH, and when the calcium is being pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So it goes muscle contraction, max tension, muscle relaxation period here. So with a singular twitch, one singular muscular response to a muscular stimulus does not have enough tension to go through from the muscle to the tendon to the bone to provide movement. So you need to increase the number of stimuli so there's enough tension to reach from the muscle to the tendon into the bone. So one twitch doesn't do it. So you need to increase the number of stimuli so there's a tension for a longer period of time, so the tension can move from the muscle to the bone, or to the tendon, excuse me, to the bone. So it needs to be enough tension production moving from the muscle to the tendon to the bone. So also, other than increasing the number of stimuli, so there's more tension production, also can increase the frequency of the stimuli, so there's not a decrease in tension production. So that tension production, max tension, and it goes back down, so that'd be one twitch. This would be another twitch. So if you increase the frequency of stimuli, there won't be a decrease in tension production. And instead of going down, the kind of twitches will be interlapping, so the peaks will really keep the tension production at a maintained state. You keep the muscle in a maintained state of contraction. So another word for a maintained state of muscle contraction due to an increased frequency of stimuli is called tetanus. So tetanus is the proper definition. It's the maintained state of muscle contraction due to an increased frequency of stimuli. So that's tetanus. Obviously, there's no decrease in tension production with tetanus, since it is a maintained state of contraction due to the increased frequency of stimuli. So it's kind of similar to how a plane maintains its elevation once reaching a certain point of flying, and here it would obviously be due to the frequency of the power given to the plane motor. So it's not going to go like that. The plane, once a plane reaches up top, it's a maintained state of elevation or maintained state of contraction. That'd be another way of thinking of tetanus. So we've gone over the length of the sarcomere, width of a sarcomere, number and frequency of stimuli are factors that affect the tension production within a myofiber. And last but certainly not least, fatigue is another factor that affects the tension production within a myofiber. So there's three types of fatigue. There's muscular fatigue, which is most common, neuromuscular fatigue, not as common, and then psychological fatigue, which kind of depends. It can be common for some folk, can be not common for others, and every day it might honestly fluctuate. But fatigue is the failure for muscle to produce force, essentially due to either prolonged contraction or inability to reattain a state of contraction due to repetitive reattain, a certain level of force due to repetitive contractions of the muscle. So it's pretty much the tiring of the muscle in simple terms. But muscular fatigue is what happens when a muscle is being stimulated by a neuron, but it's not capable of responding. So the muscle is being stimulated by the neuron in the brain, except it's just too tired, it's too fatigued to be able to respond to that stimulus or that neuron stimulating the muscle there. So there's obviously a lack of nutrients produced to produce ATP to allow that muscle contract. So primary factor of muscular fatigue is reduced oxygen. So if there's lack of oxygen, can't produce ATP, can't produce the energy to contract that muscle there. So neurons stimulating the muscle, but the muscle is not capable of responding. Another form of fatigue is neuromuscular fatigue. So that's when the neuron is not stimulating the muscle to the degree needed. So as with muscular fatigue, muscle is being stimulated by the neuron, but not the muscle is not capable of responding. With neuromuscular fatigue, the neuron is not stimulating the muscle to the degree needed. So an example of this would be inadequate amount of neurotransmitter. So like the inadequate amount of neurotransmitter, so to say the ACH won't be able to bind to that ACH receptor since there's an inadequate amount of it. So ACH is a neuron transmitter, and we obviously see that with neuromuscular fatigue, the inadequate amount of neurotransmitter, for example, acetylcholine. So cause of this could be hypocalcemia. There'd be a lower concentration gradient of calcium going into the synaptic bulb. So as we learned in one of the previous videos, maybe the last one, the calcium influx into the synaptic bulb causes the ACH to be secreted into the neuromuscular junction, and then the ACH will bind to that ACH receptor. But if there's low calcium obviously that concentration gradient of the calcium into the synaptic bulb is going to be less, so there's not going to be as much calcium influx. So that is a cause of neuromuscular junction, is hypocalcemia, due to that lower concentration gradient of calcium. Last but certainly not least, third type of fatigue is psychological fatigue. So psychological fatigue is a happens whenever the neuron in the brain isn't even sending an impulse to the neuron in the spinal cord to start the reaction. So neuron in the brain goes to neuron in the spinal cord, which goes to the myofiber. In this case, the neuron in the brain isn't even sending an impulse to the neuron in the spinal cord, which would then send the electrical impulse to the myofiber. So in this case, no neuron sending it in the brain, sending to the neuron in the spinal cord, so the reaction is not even going to start. So obviously the muscle is not going to contract. So psychological fatigue, neuron in brain isn't sending impulse to neuron in the spinal cord to start the reaction, essentially. So those are the four types of or four factors, that affect the tension production within a myofiber. That's the length of a sarcomere, width of a sarcomere, number and frequency of stimuli, and fatigue is the fourth factor. In the next video here, we're going to check out the factors that affect tension production within a muscle organ. See you soon.